9. Alan McCarthy Jr. During a family court hearing in Volusia County, Florida in 2017, 36-year-old Alan McCarthy Jr. was deemed unfit to see his kids. He'd recently been accused of violating a restraining order and threatening family members, and he had a lengthy criminal history, which spanned 3 states and included prior convictions for domestic violence, kidnapping, and indecent exposure. McCarthy became furious with the judge, Stasia Warren. After the hearing, he dialed 911 and said that he wanted to report a crime that was about to happen. He instructed the dispatcher to bring Judge Warren into the parking lot so he could execute her, and he also threatened the dispatcher. After hanging up, McCarthy called 3 more dispatchers and continued making threats against Warren. He was charged with threatening a public official. When the courtroom was ordered to rise at the beginning of his trial, McCarthy remained seated and gave the judge the middle finger, yelling that he wasn't under oath. He then launched into a verbal tirade about how the court was unfair for taking his kids away from him, and he threatened the judge. The judge asked McCarthy, "Do you want to be here or not?" He replied that he didn't want to be there and that he was being unconstitutionally prosecuted. McCarthy accused the court of violating his rights and blamed everyone except himself for where his choices had landed him. Foxman remained calm while court officers surrounded McCarthy, just in case something was about to happen. The defendant was ultimately removed from the courtroom and put behind a 2-way mirror, where he was out of sight but could still hear and respond to everything that was going on. He continued to yell and cuss, but the case eventually proceeded. The jury deliberated for just 30 minutes before finding McCarthy guilty, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. 8. Isaiah Gardenhire. 40-year-old Isaiah Gardenhire was out on bond for a pending assault charge in 2021 when he went on a violent 2-day crime spree in Isabella County, Michigan. He'd been released from jail just 4 days earlier for the previous case when he broke into his girlfriend's home, brutally assaulted her, and fatally stabbed her daughter. Gardenhire then went to the Lansing home of 39-year-old Harley Owens and his girlfriend, 29-year-old Kelsey Kuhn Lennon, and shot them both dead. He went to the home of another man and woman, held them hostage, assaulted the female, and fled the scene in the couple's vehicle. 45 hours after the crime spree began, Gardenhire turned himself in to the police. He would eventually end up facing charges for home invasion, 3 murder counts, and more. During his arraignment over video chat, he paid little attention to what was going on while yawning loudly, dozing off, and repeatedly giving the judge the middle finger. The judge reminded Gardenhire that she was about to decide whether to grant bond, so it was in his best interest to play nice. He responded by repeatedly flipping the bird and claiming that his ex-girlfriend had killed her daughter. After having the judge threaten to silence his microphone and turn his camera off, he went back to napping and yawning. Gardenhire is serving concurrent sentences of 50 to 125 years for the murders of Kuhn, Lennon, and Owens, and 75 to 120 years for murdering his girlfriend's daughter. He'll most likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. 7. Joseph Zieler. A cold case double murder out of Florida from 1990 was finally solved in 2016 when DNA evidence belonging to the killer turned up as a match to 54-year-old Joseph Zieler. The connection was made after Zieler was required to give a DNA sample in an unrelated felony battery case. 26 years earlier, the suspect had assaulted, beaten, and strangled 32-year-old Lisa Story and her friend's daughter Robin Cornell at a condominium in Cape Coral. Despite the DNA findings, Zieler denied being the killer, but the jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death. During his sentencing hearing, the convicted killer flashed an unusually wide smile with the word killer written on what looked like a set of dentures. According to Zieler's attorney, the false teeth were actually a veneer made from styrofoam which he'd crafted in jail. A short while later, Zieler motioned for his attorney, Kevin Shirley, to come talk to him while he stood in the courtroom surrounded by bailiffs. When Shirley came over, Zila motioned for him to lower his head as if he had to discuss a private matter. But he tried to elbow Shirley in the face instead and was instantly taken down by the bailiffs. Shirley told the Mirror that he and Zila had a good working relationship up until that point. He'd spoken with the cold-blooded killer in close proximity before and had never been attacked. Only Zila knows why he acted the way he did, and thankfully society will never have to deal with him again. 6. Willie Campbell. In May 2006, a 42-year-old homeless man named Willie Campbell became combative with paramedics and cops after a Good Samaritan saw him unconscious outside a building in Dallas and called for help. He kicked a police officer and spat into the mouth and eye of another officer while being arrested for public intoxication. Campbell taunted the cop, claiming he was HIV positive, and he was charged with harassing a public servant, with the prosecution arguing that his virus-infected saliva qualified as the deadly weapon. Additionally, the state charged Campbell with the habitual offender enhancement, which meant that he would face a minimum of 25 years in prison if convicted as charged. His prior convictions included more than 24 offenses, including a previous attack on 2 officers and biting 2 inmates. Campbell has been HIV positive since 1994, but none of the officers he attacked contracted the virus. During his trial, he denied resisting arrest or spitting on anyone. The jury found him guilty, prompting him to lash out at the prosecution team and other courtroom personnel, calling them liars and accusing them of railroading an innocent man. He went on an anti-cop tirade, claiming that the officers at his arrest scene had lied about his behavior, and began calling the judge and other people in the courtroom disparaging names, most of which are too inappropriate to be in this video. Campbell talked over anyone who tried to get a word in edgewise, and was eventually removed from the courtroom and taken into a holding cell for the remainder of the proceeding. His behavior did him no favors, and he was sentenced to 35 years in prison. 5. Christopher Alio. Less than 2 years after being released from prison for vehicular homicide, Christopher Alio found himself back inside the Clark County, Washington jail on allegations of domestic violence and abuse. In 2017, he was accused of viciously attacking a family member during a violent outburst at his home. As media reporters descended upon the scene later that day, a neighbor described seeing the police at the house on a pretty regular basis. During his first court hearing, Alio remained calm until the moment the judge set his bail at $50,000. Almost immediately after hearing the amount, he slammed his fists onto the stand and started yelling about how he'd been doing well for 10 months. He blamed the court for landing him back in the system, even though he ended up there due to his own poor decisions. Deputies rushed over and grabbed Alio in an attempt to rush him out of the courtroom before his explosive behavior escalated. He screamed obscenities at the deputies and fought back with every ounce of strength he had, despite being handcuffed. When it became clear that he wasn't going to calm down, deputies strapped him into a specialized restraint chair and wheeled him back to jail. 4. Timothy Dematio. When 34-year-old rock musician Timothy Dematio was brought into a Broward County, Florida courtroom in October 2014 on suspicion of theft, he came prepared to argue his case. He was accused of stuffing nutritional supplements down his pants at a Walgreens store and destroying property after being caught by employees. Dematio denied the theft allegation up and down, insisting that he was being falsely accused and that his constitutional rights were being violated. As his frustration grew, so did the volume of his voice. It was hard for Judge John Hurley to believe the man's claims of innocence after taking a quick look at his recent arrest history, which included allegations that he ran up a $250 tab at a Mexican restaurant and refused to pay while also refusing to leave. The defendant was also serving an 18-month probation sentence for grand theft stemming from another incident. Dematio wouldn't stop talking, so his defense lawyer silenced his microphone. He could be seen drumming and continuing to shout, even though the judge couldn't hear him. At one point during the hearing, Judge Hurley spent a few seconds observing Dematio's behavior and simply uttered, "Oh boy." The accused thief remained uncooperative, making it impossible to accomplish much throughout the hearing. Needless to say, he was eventually dragged out of the courtroom by deputies. 3. Scott Nelson. Within months of being released from a Florida prison in 2017 after serving time for a bank robbery charge, 53-year-old career criminal Scott Nelson once again fell into his lifelong rut of failing to survive on an honest living. He found himself living on the streets of upscale Winter Park, where he started to feel sorry for himself and bitterly jealous of people who could afford nice things. It was this mindset that made Nelson feel entitled to pick a house and rob it. He would later claim that his goal was to obtain enough money to skip out on parole and leave the area. But the crime became horrifically violent when he kidnapped 56-year-old Jennifer Fulford, who worked as a nanny for the family who owned the house he broke into. After withdrawing money from an ATM using Fulford's bank card, Nelson stabbed her to death and dumped her body in a wooded area. He admitted to the murder in court and claimed that he never meant to kill her. But his entire confession was cold, remorseless, and matter-of-fact, as if he were talking about an object rather than a human life he took. Nelson described Fulford as collateral damage and straightforwardly admitted that he killed the victim because he needed money, with not even the slightest tinge of regret detectable in his voice. At the same time, he seemed to conveniently forget a lot of details about the actual murder, indicating that he just didn't want to face his actions, while at the same time shamelessly describing himself as a homicidal maniac. Nelson asked for the death penalty after being found guilty, but was sentenced to life in prison without parole. 2. Shawn Rker. In 2009, 41-year-old Shawn Rker of Wind Lake, Wisconsin, was accused of habitually terrorizing his own family to the point where they lived in constant fear and danger. By then, he'd already served federal prison time for setting off pipe bombs in public places. The family reached out to law enforcement for help, claiming that Rker's behavior had only gotten more volatile over time. He was arrested on a litany of felonies including reckless endangerment, strangulation, abuse, causing mental harm, and more. Rker was being held on his pending charges at the Racine County Jail in 2010 when he bent a steel door while breaking out of a high-security wing. He went on a destructive rampage, causing over $5,000 worth of damage to the jail, and was sentenced to 7.5 years for escape. In the meantime, he was convicted of 16 crimes against his family. During a pre-sentencing hearing in early 2012, Rker was wheeled into the courtroom wearing a spit mask and strapped to a chair. He was surrounded by a team of heavily armed deputies in helmets who remained ready to spring into action even though the defendant was in restraints. Rker immediately began screaming profanities at the judge at the top of his lungs and repeatedly threatening to hunt down and kill the judge and prosecution team. Every time the judge started to speak, Rker screamed over him as loudly as possible. He was reportedly angry after learning that the judge planned to sentence him to over 200 years in prison, which he's currently serving at a Supermax facility. To this day, he refuses to admit guilt and insists that he was wrongfully convicted. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear even more stories, stay tuned for some extra content that you might have missed. 1. Milton Watts. After turning himself in on a warrant for failing to appear in court in Berea, Ohio on a domestic violence charge, 21-year-old Milton Watts went before Judge Chris Green, who's known for his no-nonsense approach to criminal cases. When Green asked Watts why he missed his last court date, the defendant nonchalantly explained that there was no reason for him to be there. Green reminded Watts that his requested presence wasn't an engraved invitation, but a court order. He went on to inform the young man that his lawyer had withdrawn from the case and that he needed to hire a new one. Watts replied, "I don't need no lawyer." When Green asked Watts if he wanted to discuss bond, he said, "I don't give an F, to be honest with you." Unwilling to tolerate the attitude, Green sentenced Watts to 30 days in jail for contempt. He tried advising the young man to make the situation easier by acting right, but Watts continued to lash out, raising his voice and swearing as he called Green a B-word and a son of a B-word, and accused the judge through tears of ruining his life. As the outburst continued, Green added more jail time for contempt. Milton's family members begged him to calm down, but by the time he listened, Green had increased his sentence to 360 days. The judge eventually reduced the sentence to 90 days, but Watts only served 5 days for his original charges, which meant that he could have almost entirely avoided jail time if he'd maintained better self-control in court.
Number 11. Heroes arrive at the right time. A group of 5 friends walked home from dinner in Ashton-under-Lyne, England one evening in 2019 when they spotted a man dragging a woman into an alleyway. The culprit was holding the victim down and had his hand over her mouth to stop her from screaming. However, when the suspect realized that someone was watching him, he ran. One member of the group stayed behind to comfort the terrified victim, while the other 4 friends chased after the attacker, who was later identified as 23-year-old Ryan Bennison. They managed to catch up with him and sat on him until the police arrived to handle the situation. The victim was on her way to visit her brother that evening when Bennison approached her and asked for a cigarette. She gave one to him and walked away, but he approached her again a little while later asking for a lighter. They then smoked a cigarette together, which was when Bennison began putting the moves on her. After going along with his advances for just a few seconds, the woman decided she didn't want to continue. She pulled away, and when he didn't stop, she pushed him off her and began walking away. Bennison persisted though, inviting her over to his place. When she said no and kept walking, the man didn't give up. He grabbed the victim and started dragging her, at which point the 5 heroes saw what was happening and intervened. In court, Bennison claimed that he was being falsely accused and that he was tickling the victim, which was what caused her muffled screams. His lawyer later argued that Bennison acted on impulse, but that he wasn't cold and calculating. He ultimately pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. Number 10. No time for clothes. During the early morning hours one day in late 2022, former military officer Scott Freeman awoke to his dog barking inside his home in Australia's Gold Coast. He chased after a group of young thieves who'd broken into his house, but they managed to escape. The teams made off with a handful of items, including Freeman's wife's purse and some jewelry, but he was mainly glad that his family was safe and that the perpetrators were gone. Freeman and his wife went back to bed, unaware that the suspects had left the back door ajar with plans to return. Less than an hour later, the couple woke up to a commotion once again. Remembering how the thieves had failed to take his wallet and car keys during the first robbery and were likely back for both items, Freeman didn't waste any time getting dressed. He rushed downstairs in his underwear and cornered 2 of the suspects. Freeman managed to tackle one of them and tried getting the young man to unlock his phone so he could call the police. Neighbors overheard the noise and called the police, who arrested the suspect. Unfortunately, Freeman wasn't convinced that much would be done about the crime, especially as thefts skyrocket in the Gold Coast region. He told Today that he didn't blame the police for the ongoing issues with crime and that he believed they were doing everything they can. However, he said that he hoped politicians would make the legislative changes he felt were necessary to get the problem under control. Number 9. Transient takedown. While riding their bikes through Bloomington, Indiana one day in 2021, 2 transients spotted a man who they believed had tried to run them over with a car at a homeless encampment the night before. Instead of calling the police, they decided to try taking the suspect down on their own. He repeatedly tried to flee, even after the man hit him in the legs with a metal bat and stopped him from getting into a passing car. At some point, officers joined the pursuit and caught up with him. The suspect was later identified as 42-year-old Robert Dustin Pittman. He turned down medical treatment despite some bleeding wounds on his legs from being hit with the bat, and he declined to press charges against the men who chased after him. However, Pittman had some warrants out for his arrest for unrelated incidents, and police discovered probable cause that led them to believe that he'd stolen a car. Inside the vehicle he was driving, they found items that had been reported stolen by break-in victims. Unfortunately, though, Pittman wasn't charged in connection with the incident at the homeless encampment due to a lack of evidence. In addition to the charges listed in the arrest warrants, he was charged with vehicle theft, 4 counts of theft, and 2 counts of unauthorized entry into a vehicle. Although this case happened back in 2021, the outcome is unclear. Number 8. Civilians nab alleged cop killer. Early one morning in 2022, a trio of thieves burglarized a home in the South African city of Tshwane. The family fought back, but 41-year-old off-duty cop Tumelo Losaba was fatally wounded in the process. One of the suspects was also killed in the encounter, while another sped off in a getaway vehicle. The third thief fled on foot, but he couldn't escape the several residents who emerged from their homes and chased after him. He was subsequently apprehended and taken into custody on suspicion of murder and robbery. In the meantime, authorities launched a manhunt in search of the man who successfully fled the scene. A police spokesperson commended the community members who bravely stepped in to ensure that the alleged killer was brought to justice. However, the agency also reminded the public that while citizens' arrests are legal in the country, the law states that the person carrying out the arrest must have witnessed the crime or at least needs to have reasonable suspicion of the suspect's guilt. They must also have the intention of turning the suspect over to police as soon as possible. Number 7. Market boss tackles meat thief. Much like the US and many other countries, Australia is facing skyrocketing food costs due to inflation. It's made certain groceries popular among thieves, including meat. And it's not just people in need who are stealing these items, but habitual criminals who are using it as a currency to buy drugs. Store owners are understandably getting frustrated with the increase in thefts, including one supermarket CEO who decided to take matter into his own hands when he saw a repeat offender stealing at his family's own business in Sydney. By the time this particular incident happened in early 2023, the suspect had allegedly stolen thousands of dollars worth of meat from the store. Footage of the incident shows the thief wheeling a suitcase filled with prime cuts of beef as the shop owner chases after him and tackles him to the ground. The businessman performed a citizen's arrest, and the suspect was subsequently taken into custody. Unfortunately, this likely won't be the only theft of its kind that the owner will be faced with. As prices continue to rise, it's possible that certain types of food will become increasingly valuable on the black market. Number 6. Aggressive flyer pinned by passengers. In 2022, chaos broke out on a Ryanair flight from London to Lithuania when an intoxicated passenger lost his cool because employees asked him to stop drinking alcohol. The man began shouting aggressively at fellow passengers, including someone who had a child with them. Someone that was believed to be the irate man's father tried to restrain him during the tirade, only to get punched. 2 employees stepped in, but their attempt to de-escalate the situation had the opposite effect. As the man's behavior became increasingly threatening, several passengers surrounded him and helped the employees in their efforts to calm him down. When it became clear that he wasn't going to comply, the 2 employees and fed-up passengers restrained the man, with as many as 7 people joining in to get him under control. Cell phone footage of the incident shows the problematic passenger disappearing from view as the group wrestles him to the ground. The man was arrested once the plane landed, and according to a passenger who spoke with the press, his father was mortified by the whole situation. Number 5. Bystanders stand for justice. A 19-year-old woman had just finished her work shift at a business in Sydney at around 1 a.m. in 2023 when she found a strange middle-aged man sitting in her car. Bystanders rushed over to the woman's aid and repeatedly asked the man to exit the vehicle. He responded by assaulting the woman and a 49-year-old man who'd come by to help. The suspect then tried to flee, but the civilians who witnessed his violent behavior weren't about to let that happen. They subsequently tackled him to the ground and held him there until police arrived. The woman suffered facial injuries but declined medical treatment, while the 49-year-old victim was taken to the hospital with multiple head wounds. After also receiving treatment for injuries, the suspect was taken into police custody. He was charged with entering a vehicle without the consent of the owner-occupier, 2 counts of assault, reckless wounding, and using an offensive weapon with the intent to commit an indictable offense. This case happened so recently that an outcome has yet to be reached. Hopefully, though, the suspect will get what he deserves. Number 4. Disrobing passenger tied to chair. Shortly after a passenger jet took off from Vladivostok, Russia one day in 2021, a 39-year-old woman who appeared to be under the influence of some type of drug rose from her seat and began wandering around the cabin. She appeared disoriented as she removed her clothes and put them back on, paying no mind to the employees who were ordering her to sit down. Concerned about the woman's state of mind as well as their own safety, onlookers worked together with crew members to get her back to her seat, where they restrained her using rope, tape, and a seatbelt. She was kept there for the rest of the flight, and she was arrested when the plane landed in Novosibirsk. The woman allegedly admitted to having taken a synthetic drug before she boarded the flight. She was taken for a medical exam to determine her level of intoxication and was consequently charged with petty hooliganism. Number 3. Local heroes stop armed robbery. 2 men entered a tobacco shop in Sydney, Australia one afternoon in early 2023 and robbed it at gunpoint, then attempted to make off with stolen cigarettes, lighters, and several $1,000s in cash. They drew the attention of nearby customers in the shopping center where the business was located, and civilians immediately sprang into action to stop the thieves. One young woman wasted no time rushing into the store. She grabbed onto one of the suspects who hit her with an ashtray, but the teen kept fighting, dragging the man down by his hoodie and holding his wrist behind his back. The girl's mother, who'd worked in security for over 20 years, overheard the chaos and rushed over, along with other bystanders, including a woman who removed the keys from the ignition of the thieves' getaway car. In the meantime, others pinned the robbers to the ground and held them there. The shoppers, who were praised as local heroes, were unaware that the suspects were armed. It was only after police arrived and found a gun on one of the men that the civilians realized how much worse things could have gone. Number 2. Fraud victim tracks down perpetrator. When the police didn't seem interested in helping catch the criminal who broke into his car and stole his wife's purse, 38-year-old Scott Dunster was determined to bring the culprit to justice. The theft happened outside the couple's home in East Sussex, England on New Year's Eve in 2022. After discovering that the perpetrator bought something with a debit card for an account that he shared with his wife, Dunster went to the store and asked to see their surveillance footage from the time of the purchase. He took images from the footage to the police, but they didn't address the case as quickly as Dunster wanted them to. So he posted the photos on social media, and community members quickly identified the suspect as 27-year-old Joseph Koss. One day, Dunster's friend spotted Koss out in public. When he failed to reach the police, he went to the location and confronted the suspect himself, who attempted to flee. Dunster chased after Koss, running about 1,800 feet through the town center before catching up with and tackling the alleged thief to the ground with help from nearby security guards. In the end, Koss pled guilty to fraud for using the debit card, but there wasn't enough evidence to charge him in the theft of the purse, which was eventually found. As a result, he was sentenced to 35 weeks in prison. Number 1. Off-Duty Cop Catches Thieving Teens. In 2022, 2 teens with hilariously bad luck decided to steal a van on Boxing Day in Australia and caught the attention of a large civilian and an off-duty police officer. They were first spotted by 6'4" Gold Coast businessman Bradley Cowper, who noticed the van driving erratically, reaching speeds of up to 75 miles per hour and narrowly avoiding a cyclist. When Cowper saw 2 young men inside the vehicle wearing COVID masks and gloves, he began to suspect it was stolen. He'd been the victim of a car theft before, so he felt a duty to get to the bottom of the situation. As soon as the van stopped long enough for him to approach, he walked up, opened the door, and tried grabbing the driver, who threw the vehicle into reverse and initially managed to avoid capture. A few minutes later, Cowper spotted the van on a curb with visible damage. Unlike the first encounter, the young men froze with fear as the entrepreneur approached. Cowper yelled out to bystanders for help detaining the boys, one of whom begged for his life, while the other said that his mom was going to kill him. There just happened to be an off-duty cop living in a nearby house who overheard the commotion and came out to help. The clearly terrified suspects continued to apologize profusely as they were held to the ground until police arrived.
Thanks for watching. What would be worse, bursting into uncontrollable laughter during a serious court proceeding, or being accused of fake crying while trying to genuinely apologize to someone for something you did wrong and truly feel bad about? Let us know in the comments below and remember to subscribe. See you soon. Bye.